Okay, Loretto, thank you again for all the techie assistance. Thank you. And this is a course, as Loretto has said, where we're trying to explore the book of Amos. And the title is Let Justice Well Up Like Water, with a subtitle, Right Relations Rooted in Justice. Now, that title is a piece of poetry from the book of Amos itself, but it's taken from the Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, and the book of Amos. And it's a poetic title, Let Justice Well Up Like Water. And over the 8 sessions, we will look at different themes and perspectives from Amos. It's part of our public theology course at Dramalis. We begin this evening with a different way of thinking and social alternatives. Next week, we look at Deuteronomy, the prophetic stream and public theology. Now, you may wonder why that's in there. It's because the book of Deuteronomy in its final form comes from the same era as the final form of the book of Amos, and there are connecting theological and social themes in those 2 pieces of writing. Week 3, we look at God of Nations, God of War with a question mark. 4, God does Exodus in the plural. And 5, indifferent extravagance and economic inequalities. Week 6, theology and conflict as competing social visions. Theologies conflict sometimes, but behind them there are competing social visions and different social visions. And we'll begin, I hope, to see that from Amos. The penultimate week, spare me the sound of your hymns. Amos had interesting things to say there. And finally, on the last week, is there a future? And with so much that seems like judgment in the book of Amos, we may wonder at times, did Amos see any hope at all? Or did he see a future or a possibility of a future? I think there are future indications or pointers in Amos, and we'll hopefully arrive at that on the last evening. But tonight, a different way of thinking and social alternatives. And I want to begin by talking, well, let's say I'll talk for a little while, and then we'll go into discussion group. Loretto has some questions that she got from me earlier, and we'll take a break about the middle somewhere, come back to part 2 again, some input, brief input, and then more shared conversation together. But I wanted to begin by talking about or introducing you to a person you may or may not have heard of, Abraham Heschel. Now, Heschel was one of the leading Jewish biblical scholars of the 20th century, and his great book, The Prophets, published in 1962, was recognized immediately as a masterpiece of biblical scholarship. It brought to Jews and Christians profoundly fresh and deep knowledge of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. And that book was, and it remains, a monumental and quite brilliant book. Heschel was born in Warsaw in 1907. His mother, it seems, had such a special piety that people would often ask her to pray on their behalf. His father was a Hasidic Rebbe, caring for a congregation of impoverished Jews. And Abraham Heschel himself seems to have been a rather special child, often it seems being stood on a table to recite Jewish texts. He was always grateful that he grew up surrounded by people of spiritual depth. As a young man, he went to study in Berlin, which was the intellectual center of Europe in the 1930s. He studied at a Jewish Reform Movement center where a new scientific approach to Jewish texts was taken. He also studied at the Orthodox Jewish Seminary. Now, Heschel realized quickly that his professors lacked a real Jewish understanding of the Bible. He submitted his doctoral thesis in 1932, and he took his viva just weeks after Hitler came to power. Now, even with a successful viva, a doctorate could not be awarded until the thesis was published. And in Nazi Germany, that was extremely difficult for a Jewish person. His doctorate on the prophetic consciousness was published in Krakow in 1935 to a great deal of acclaim in Europe and the USA. Significantly, perhaps, German biblical scholars were much less enthusiastic. I suppose here we are all products of our historical context. And Heschel's problem in Germany was that German Protestants, and remember, most Prussian German Protestants actually voted for Hitler. German Protestants wanted to delete the Hebrew texts from the Christian Bible. It was a Jewish book, and it had to go. And unbelievably, there were others who wanted to retain the Hebrew Bible because the prophets were repeatedly condemning the sins of Israel. Well, we need to keep that in, they were saying. Heschel was living in Nazi Germany, and he escaped at the last minute. In Poland, his mother and 3 sisters were murdered by the Nazis. As a result of these experiences, Heschel developed a deeper commitment to his Jewish faith and a deep sensitivity to the suffering of all people. It was this latter sensitivity that produced his greatest insight into the prophets and great insight into the heart of God, the divine pathos. As a student in Berlin, he was deeply affected by not only the lack of biblical knowledge among his professors, but by the isolated and unrelated nature of philosophy and thinking. The times were challenging, but philosophy was irrelevant to those times and seemed to be indifferent to the big issues of good and evil. The thinking, or the lack of it, he believed, was destructive of human responsibility. Heschel was deeply disturbed by thought that had gone astray and by a spiritual bankruptcy. It was, he said, the realization that the right coins were not available in the common currency that drove me to study the thought of the prophets. The historical situation in Berlin in the 1930s drove Heschel to the study of the Hebrew prophets. He said, in the face of the tragic failure of the modern mind, incapable of preventing its own destruction, it became clear to me that the most important philosophical problem of the 20th century was to find a new set of presuppositions or premises, a different way of thinking. For Heschel, the new set of presuppositions or premises, that different way of thinking, was found in the Hebrew prophets. The challenge of his time, a world sliding towards the Holocaust and catastrophic war, devoid of moral thinking and spiritually bankrupt, drove him to a different way of thinking, or a different imagination that was shaped by those Hebrew prophets. Now, these remarkable people were operative from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, part of that very remarkable era in human history described as the Axial Age from 900 to 300 BCE, which saw a global explosion of spirituality and ethical consciousness, of which these Hebrew prophets were an integral part. Heschel moved to New York in 1940, and he became a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Steeped by this stage in the different thinking of the Hebrew prophets and the prophetic consciousness, Heschel became a leading activist in the civil rights movement and publicly active in protests against the Vietnam War. Rooted in the thinking and imagination of the Hebrew prophets, such activism was the logic of alternative social imagination. Those Hebrew prophets still command attention and imaginative action. Let's take a brief look then at Amos in context. This study is focused over the next weeks on only one of those prophets. And Amos is the first of the written prophets and has had a major impact on Jewish and Christian thought and imagination. He belongs to the middle of the 8th century BCE, probably 752 BCE. Now, after the disastrous reign of Solomon, there were a series of revolts, and the result was a division or partition of the Hebrew community. Solomon's legacy was a divided kingdom, a kingdom of Judah in the south and the northern kingdom of Israel in the north. Amos was from the southern kingdom, a shepherd, a grower of figs. He made his way to the northern kingdom with an uncomfortable message of judgment. He uttered the unthinkable and the unspeakable to a people with some very strong convictions about exceptionalism and inviolability. He pointed to the end of the existence of the exceptional and the inviolable people because of God's judgment on their failure to shape a society of justice and covenantal neighbourly integrity. The failure was political, economic, social, and spiritual. And Amos knew nothing of a spiritual, secular dualism. The unjust economic failures were spiritual failures. The 8th century Northern Kingdom was a society without ethics, no matter how splendid and elaborate its religious practice was. Now we'll pause there, and perhaps Loretta will place us in rooms, as they say, on Zoom. And a first question: do we need in our time a new way of thinking? And like Abraham Heschel in 1930s Germany, can we find a new way of thinking in these prophets? So if we take 15 minutes maybe in some conversation around that question, and then we'll come back and have a shared conversation. Let's go into the second part of the evening briefly, and then we'll go back into our rooms again and have a further conversation around perhaps a couple of questions next time. But this is very much an introduction this evening to the book of Amos, background, context, and just to continue on for a few moments with context, that Amos, it seems, arrived in the northern kingdom during the very prosperous reign of Jeroboam II. And in the southern kingdom of Judah, it was also a time of great prosperity under King Uzziah. And a much fuller narrative of this prosperous era is found in 2 Kings 14 and 2 Kings 15. In a sense, people, it seems, never had it so good, except, and this is not unlike what was being mentioned in the earlier discussion, except the prosperous were the few who had become rich at the expense of the many. And in both kingdoms, the great prosperity had come about because of disastrous policies and practices of the rich against the poor. And the inequalities this created, in a sense, prophet after prophet is really saying that the inequalities that this kind of situation created were unsustainable. So for the prophets like Amos, the way things were practiced and structured in both of those kingdoms was illegitimate and unethical, they felt. And Amos had strong things to say to a wealthy elite who had cultivated and were enjoying great luxury. Because some enjoy winter and summer houses, others are losing their land and family structures are breaking down. That's Amos chapter 3. And there are those who are oblivious to the violence and oppression of their lifestyles. Indeed, for Amos, the elite hoard violence and oppression for themselves. That also is Amos 3. And again in Amos 3, society has lost its way. And this society can expect nothing, he's saying, but disaster. Now, Amos uses the very direct language of God's judgment. Now, this is theological language. No less true, though we might describe inequalities and injustices as the seeds of a society's own destruction. Running against the moral grain of the universe brings, in a very real sense, its own judgment, whether we use theological or ethical secular language. Walter Brueggemann has put it this way: thus the prophet, apparently from Judah, but at work in the northern kingdom, articulates a powerful social critique that is rooted in a vigorous Yahwistic sense of what is required and what is possible in a covenantal society. The judgment that is sure to come is voiced as the day of the Lord, when Yahweh's governance will be fully and harshly enacted. So Amos enters the northern kingdom of Israel at a time of great prosperity and great inequalities, with a very powerful social critique, a coming judgment, and, as we shall see later, an imagined social alternative. Now, in reading Amos, we take the socio-economic context of the 8th century BCE seriously, and we engage with our own socio-economic context. We also need to keep in mind that the text of Amos as we have it is not 8th century BCE. It, like all the prophets and the Torah itself, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, have all gone through editorial processes. And much of this happened during and after the devastating experience of the Babylonian exile, which was experienced as a judgment of God that shattered all senses of exceptionalism and inviolability. It became, though in the end, the most creative experience when especially literary creativity set about collecting the important writings, organizing them, rearranging them, conflating documents, undertaking a very creative editorial process, and producing a sacred text as we now know it. The exile also revisioned and reimagined God, identity, and purpose in the world. Amos, as we now read the book, went through an editorial process in which the 8th century prophet was remembered, and the speeches and poems were shaped, in Brueggemann's words, revised and supplemented to form a coherent and fairly symmetrical whole. So the final form of the book of Amos has gone through a whole interpretative process, the purpose of which is to make the northern judgment pertinent to the southern kingdom of Judah, especially when the northern kingdom had been completely wiped from history and ceased to be. I suppose they may have thought, well, Amos was right before. Now, the final form of Amos takes interpretative shape in another historical context, that of return from exile and the challenge of rebuilding society, a much more just and socio-economically and equitable society. And in the Jewish tradition to which Amos belongs, there is no final or static interpretation of a text. There is endless, ongoing theological and practical interpretation of the prophetic tradition And interpretation, as we shall see next week especially, in the key emphasis of the book of Deuteronomy, is always for today. That is Deuteronomy's key word, today. And so we too go on reading Amos in our contemporary context and try to make sense. Finally, the role of the prophet. Abram Heschel has some important insights into the nature and role of a prophet. The prophet has a sensitivity, he says, to evil. A single act of injustice to the prophets is a disaster. Injustice is a death blow to existence. It's a threat to the world. And for Heschel, they possess, these prophets, not only indignation, but what he calls moral and religious excitability, such extreme impetuosity. The prophets have a vision of the highest good. Their vision of God is a program for societal governance and structure. The good society is where there is the practice of kindness, justice, righteousness, or right relations based on justice. The prophet, for Heschel, sees the world from God's perspective. In Heschel's words, God is the focal point of the prophet's thought, and the world is seen as reflected in God. Indeed, the main task of prophetic thinking is to bring the world into divine focus. For Heschel, this is where divine pathos enters the prophetic vision. The prophet discloses, in Heschel's words, a divine pathos, not just a divine judgment. The pages of the prophetic writings are filled with the echoes of divine love, disappointment, mercy, and indignation. Perhaps divine pathos is key to the prophets. A once popular notion of these prophets was of people who foretold or predicted events, but they were never really doing prediction. They have also been cast in the role of social advocacy, but that maybe is something of a reductionist role. Prophets were more than that. Brueggemann offers a threefold interrelated role in ancient Israel's life and for contemporary engagement. The prophets are, he says, emancipated imaginers of alternative. Maybe that's worth saying again. The prophets are emancipated imaginers of alternative. And as the emancipated, they are people liberated from the predominant assumptions of their society. The political, economic, social, and even religious assumptions of contemporary society are never absolute. The prophets are not in such lockdown. As imaginers, they are not locked into the narrow world of the rational, but imagination is liberated to see the possibility of alternative realities. Beyond the conventional thinking, prophets see alternative possibilities for societies. Prophets are people of imagination. There is a social reality in front of them that is obvious, but they imagine an alternative. The alternative imagined was an alternative economy and alternative worship. Now imagine that. No dichotomy between economics and worship. Liturgy or worship is an alternative social and economic vision and a commitment to social and economic practice. And the prophets invite those who hear them to leave an old world and commit to an alternative world experienced in worship and lived in society. I suppose we might say that the faith community that neglects or ignores the prophets is not a community with faith or integrity. And as Amos pointed out way back then, its worship may be false and nothing more than a narcotic. Now, there are two questions for some conversation. How can we develop a greater sensitivity to social and moral evil in our society and enter into the divine pathos as we engage with our world? And in the faith community, and this comes back to something that was raised earlier, in the faith community, where, and not just in the faith community, where in today's world are the emancipated imaginers of alternative? Where in today's world are the emancipated imaginers of alternative? What would that mean? So Loretto has again put those questions on the bottom of the screen. If we take about 20 minutes this time and have a good conversation around both, and maybe do try to perhaps attempt some conversation around both questions, but maybe especially the last one. Okay, enjoy.